The town of Bitter Creek festered under a noon sun so merciless it bleached every last shred of compassion from the souls who called that dusty cesspool their home, leaving only the stark cruelty of small minds thriving on the torment of a crippled widow named Adelaide Moss. Adelaide had once walked the prairie with a graceful stride that stirred envy in lesser women. But a collapsing mineshaft took her husband and crushed her left leg so completely that the surgeon saw left her with a stump and a heavy crutch carved from bitter irony. Every morning, she hobbled from a leaning shack at the town's edge to draw water from the communal well. And every morning, the town's pack of grinning jackals congregated there just to delight in the uneven rhythm of her painful, laborious approach. The chief tormentor, a burly loudmouth named Harlan Cobb, who owned the saloon and the sheriff's indifference, would snatch the bucket from her trembling hands and pour it out, laughing. A one-legged hen don't need water she can't carry, so crawl home and die. His cronies, a pair of greasy, snickering brothers called the Pike Twins, would kick her crutch aside and mimic her hobble while the respectable church-going folk of Bitter Creek passed by with averted eyes and lips sealed tighter than a miser's purse. Adelaide never cried out, never begged, and that stoic silence infuriated them more than any curse ever could, because her dignity was a mirror that reflected their own hideous, rotting souls back at them without a single flattering distortion. She survived on crusts and scraps tossed behind the general store like garbage, and each night she whispered her husband's name into the darkness, not as a prayer for rescue, but as a lament for a world where mercy had been buried alongside his broken body. Then, on a morning when the dust hung low and the sky looked like a bruise, a stranger rode into Bitter Creek on a horse the color of dried blood, and the very air seemed to tighten around his presence like a fist slowly clenching around a throat. His name was Gideon, and he carried no badge, no introduction, no visible past. Only a pair of bone-handled revolvers, and a stillness so profound that even the flies seemed to hesitate before buzzing too close to his weathered, unreadable face. He dismounted at the livery and paid the boy with a single gold coin that bore a strange etching of scales, then walked directly to the saloon where Harlan Cobb held court amid a cloud of cigar smoke and cheap whiskey fumes. Gideon didn't order a drink or state his business. He simply sat at a corner table with his back to the wall, his pale gray eyes scanning the room like a ledger of debts that had fallen, seriously overdue, and were now demanding immediate collection. Harlan, loaded with arrogance, swaggered over and slapped the table, demanding, "State your purpose, stranger, because we don't abide drifters who can't buy a round or show some respect for the local gentry." Gideon looked up and said only 3 words. Each one dropped like a stone into a well. "I saw Adelaide." The name landed with a shock that froze every glass mid-air and drained the color from Harlan's piggish cheeks. That afternoon, Gideon found Adelaide behind her shack, struggling to chop kindling with her one good leg braced awkwardly, and he knelt beside her, took the hatchet gently from her scarred fingers, and split the wood in neat, efficient strokes without uttering a syllable of pity. She regarded him with the wary eyes of a creature who had learned that every kindness was a prelude to a crueler joke, but he simply stacked the logs, tipped his hat brim, and walked back toward the town's main thoroughfare with the measured gait of a man preparing for war. The first confrontation came at dusk, when the Pike Twins ambushed Gideon in the alley behind the feed store, intending to beat the stranger bloody and reinforce the pecking order that kept their pathetic egos inflated above the muck. Jed Pike swung a rusted pipe at Gideon's skull, but the man moved like liquid shadow, disarming the attack and snapping Yet's wrist with a single, precise twist that produced a sound like a dry branch breaking underfoot in a silent forest. Ned Pike froze, whimpering, as Gideon turned those pale eyes upon him and delivered a quiet verdict that was far more terrifying than any shouted threat. "You will crawl to Adelaide's door and beg her forgiveness before the sun fully sets, or I will remove your ability to kneel permanently." The twins crawled, their bravado shattered, and Adelaide watched from her doorway with an expression that could only be described as a soul waking from a long, dreamless hibernation into a world where the predators were finally being culled. Harlan Cobb, enraged by the humiliation of his chief toadies, stormed down the street with a shotgun cradled in his thick arms and bellowed for the stranger to face him like a man or be branded a yellow coward before the entire gathered citizenry. Gideon emerged from the shadows without haste, his hands hanging loose at his sides, and he addressed not Harlan, but the crowd of onlookers whose silence had been the true accomplice in every single act of cruelty Adelaide had ever suffered. He said, "You all watched her be dehumanized, and you did nothing. So now I will collect the debt you owe, and I will collect it in the currency of blood and iron, as the law of this land forgot to mint any other coin for justice." Harlan raised the shotgun, but Gideon's revolver cleared leather in a blur that defied human perception, and a single shot shattered the stock of the weapon before it could fire, sending splinters into Harlan's face and dropping him screaming into the dirt like a fallen, squealing hog. The townsfolk gasped and stumbled backward, but Gideon was not done. He walked over to the sobbing saloon owner, pressed his boot against the man's bleeding hand, and declared, "Tomorrow at high noon, you and every man who mocked her will line up on Main Street for a public accounting." That night, a frantic town council convened in secret, and the mayor, a spineless bean counter named Whitfield, proposed they form a lynch mob to overwhelm the stranger through sheer numbers and reclaim their degenerate status quo before the reckoning at noon destroyed them all. But Gideon had anticipated their cowardice, and when the mob of 20 men with torches and rifles surrounded the boarding house where he slept, they found only a neatly written note pinned to the door that read, "Kill me in the dark, and you'll never know who I wrote to before arriving. A person who will deliver this town to the territorial marshals for a mass hanging." The mob disbanded, their courage evaporating like cheap perfume, because they understood that a man who had prepared for his own death was a man who held all the leverage over those who desperately wished to keep breathing without consequence. Adelaide, having heard of the note, hobbled to the boarding house in the gray pre-dawn light and asked Gideon why he would risk his life for a woman society had discarded like a broken chair with only 3 legs remaining. He answered her with a raw honesty that cut deeper than any blade, saying, "Because I had a sister once who was lame from birth, and I stood by while a town much like this one laughed her into an early grave, and my silence has been a cancer eating at my conscience for 15 unbearable years." She reached out and touched his scarred knuckles, and for the first time since the mining accident, she allowed herself to believe that the universe might still contain a ledger where suffering could be balanced by retribution delivered with cold, unapologetic precision. High noon arrived with a sun that seemed to hold its breath as the entire population of Bitter Creek lined the boardwalks, and Gideon stood alone in the center of the dusty street, his revolvers holstered, but his presence a weapon sharper than any steel. Harlan Cobb, his hand bandaged and his face a mask of venomous desperation, limped forward with the Pike twins and half a dozen other sycophants, each man armed and each man sweating through his shirt with the knowledge that this moment would redefine the rest of their miserable lives. Gideon raised his voice so that it carried to every ear, and he pronounced the terms of the reckoning. "You will each confess your specific cruelty to Adelaide Moss, and then you will receive the same number of lashings as the days you tormented her, or I will exact the penalty in lead." Jed Pike, his wrist still splinted, fell to his knees and blubbered a confession of stealing her pension money and pouring her medicine into the hog trough. And Gideon counted aloud the days before ordering the man to bare his back for the first 10 strokes of a leather whip he produced from his saddlebag. One by one, the bullies submitted to the lash, their cries echoing down the street. And when a few tried to bolt, Gideon's pistol barked and bullets buried themselves in the dirt inches from their fleeing feet, forcing them back to face the justice they had evaded for so long. Ned Pike confessed to spraying lies that Adelaide had poisoned her own husband, and he received 15 strokes that left his back a canvas of crimson stripes. His pride shredded so completely that he could not meet the eyes of his own reflection ever again for the remainder of his pathetic days. Harlan Cobb, the last and guiltiest, was sentenced to 50 lashes, one for each week since he had first begun tormenting the widow, and the crowd watched in horrified silence as the whip rose and fell, each crack a thunderclap of moral arithmetic settling long overdue accounts. When the punishment was complete, and Harlan lay unconscious in a pool of his own blood and shame, Gideon turned to the assembled townsfolk and delivered a chilling eulogy for their complicity. This town's silence was a permission slip signed in ink made from a widow's tears. And now you will watch her rise while you choke on the memory of your cowardice. He walked to where Adelaide stood leaning on her crutch, her cheeks wet but her spine as straight as the iron rod that surgeons had implanted to save the remnant of her shattered leg. And he extended his hand not as a savior, but as an equal partner in the business of reclaiming human worth. She took his hand, and together they walked the length of Main Street, a procession of two souls who had transformed a day of blood into a cathedral of accountability, and not a single person dared to utter a word as they passed. The days that followed were strange and silent, because the town had been stripped of its favorite entertainment, and the bullies, now nursing their wounds, began to avoid the public eye with the furtive shame of nocturnal rodents caught in a barn lantern's sudden glare. Adelaide, however, did not retreat. She opened a small sewing business from her shack, and the women who had previously ignored her now brought their mending with downcast eyes, their coins a trembling token of a community's unspoken collective apology. Gideon stayed on as a kind of unofficial arbiter, sleeping in a room above the blacksmith's shop, and he made it known that any relapse into the old cruelty would be met with a swift personal session of the whip that would make the first reckoning seem like a gentle rebuke by comparison. One evening, Adelaide asked him why he didn't simply ride away now that the debt was settled, and he confessed that he had fallen in love with the sound of her laugh, which had emerged tentatively like the first desert bloom after a decade of drought, fragile but fiercely determined to exist. She blushed, a warmth flooding her body that had nothing to do with the sunset, and she admitted that she had begun to see in his silent, scarred presence the blueprint for a future she had long ago burned to ashes in the fireplace of her despair. Their courtship was not a grand affair, but a quiet stitching of two fractured lives. He taught her to shoot a small pistol so she would never feel defenseless again, and she taught him to read the poetry she had hidden under her mattress, verses about mountains that never bowed to the wind. The town's transformation was gradual but undeniable. The saloon, now under new management after Harlan fled the territory, became a place of civil conversation, and the well where Adelaide had been tormented was renamed Mercy's Fountain by a popular, informal vote. A traveling photographer captured an image of Gideon and Adelaide standing side by side, her crutch held like a scepter and his hand resting gently on her shoulder. And that tintype became a best-selling curiosity across the territory, a visual testament to the day justice rode in on a blood-red horse. But the seed of darkness in Bitter Creek had not been entirely eradicated. A distant cousin of the Pike brothers, a hired gun named Virgil Slade, received word of the humiliation and rode in with vengeance burning in his chest and a nickel-plated Colt revolver slung low on his hip. Virgil challenged Gideon in the street, calling him a self-appointed executioner who had overstepped the bounds of any reasonable moral code. And he accused Adelaide of bewitching a good man into becoming a monster who brutalized the innocent for the sake of a woman's misplaced pride. Gideon accepted the challenge, but with a condition that startled everyone. If he won the duel, Virgil would publicly apologize to Adelaide and then serve 1 month of hard labor repairing her dilapidated shack under her direct supervision, learning what true penance felt like. The duel took place at dawn, and the two men faced each other with a stillness that turned the air to glass. And when the signal cloth dropped, Virgil's shot went wide because his hand trembled with the guilt of a man who knew deep down that his cause was rotten at its core. Gideon, in contrast, fired with the calm certainty of a celestial accountant, and his bullet struck the pistol from Virgil's hand without grazing the skin. A display of marksmanship so precise that even the deputy dropped his coffee mug in disbelief and immediate involuntary awe. True to the terms, Virgil knelt before Adelaide and stammered an apology that cracked the last shell of his pride. And then he spent 30 days hauling lumber and nailing shingles while the crippled widow directed him with a voice that had grown firm and unapologetic, a voice that now expected obedience. By the time his sentence ended, Virgil Slade was a changed man who asked to stay on as a hired hand. And Adelaide, with the wisdom of a woman who understood that redemption must be offered if it is ever to be received, granted him a small wage and a place in the barn. The territory marshal eventually visited to investigate reports of vigilante violence, but after interviewing a dozen townsfolk who spoke with trembling gratitude about the end of Harlan Cobb's reign, he closed his notebook and told Gideon, "The law owes you a debt it can't pay, so I'll just mark this town as reformed and forget I ever came." Adelaide's sewing business expanded into a cooperative that employed other widows and outcast women, and the shack was rebuilt into a sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch where Gideon sat each evening, cleaning his guns while she read aloud from her beloved poetry collections. Their wedding was the first truly joyful event Bitter Creek had celebrated since its founding, and a ceremony was held at Mercy's Fountain, where a preacher who had once averted his eyes now wept openly while pronouncing them husband and wife before a crowd that had finally learned to applaud virtue instead of mocking affliction. Adelaide wore a dress of sky blue calico that she had sewn herself, and she walked hobbled, rather, but with a radiance that needed no apology to meet Gideon, who had traded his black duster for a brushed broadcloth coat that still couldn't quite hide the butt of his revolver, the ever-present guardian of their hard-won peace. Years flowed like the creek that had given the town its name, and the children born to Adelaide and Gideon inherited their mother's unbreakable spirit and their father's quiet, unnerving stillness, a combination that made them natural leaders of a new generation that never knew the taste of the old cruelty. Adelaide's crutch eventually rested in a corner as a museum piece, because Gideon had commissioned a prosthetic limb from a specialist in St. Louis, a beautiful contraption of carved walnut and brass joints that allowed her to walk almost smoothly, a triumph of human ingenuity wedded to stubborn love. The old guard of bullies either died, reformed, or moved on, and those who remained could never quite meet Adelaide's eyes, for they carried the memory of the whip and the deeper, more searing scar of having witnessed a woman they had scorned become the moral compass of an entire community. Gideon's hair turned silver, and his hands grew stiff with arthritis, but he never stopped wearing the bone-handled revolvers, and every year on the anniversary of the reckoning, he would stand on Main Street at high noon and simply bow his head in a moment of silent, iron-clad remembrance. Adelaide, in her later years, wrote a memoir titled The Crippled Widow Who Witnessed Justice, and every copy sold across the territory was inscribed with the same dedication: to the silent rider who paid my debt with blood, and to every soul who believes that even the broken can hold the scales of righteousness. When the telegram came announcing that Harlan Cobb had died of liver failure in a squalid brothel 2 territories away, Adelaide read it without a flicker of satisfaction, then crumpled the paper and tossed it into the stove, saying only, "He's no longer a debt I need to remember, for the ledger is now completely clean." Gideon passed first on a crisp autumn morning, his hand still wrapped around his revolver, as if ready to defend her even in the sleep from which there is no waking. And Adelaide buried him on a hill overlooking the town with a headstone that read, "Here lies the cold reckoning that set a soul free." She lived another 7 years, a white-haired matriarch who taught the town's children that true justice is never about the violence, but about the restoration of the dignity that violence sought to destroy. And she made them memorize the names of every bully so they would recognize the seeds of cruelty in their own hearts. On the day of her funeral, the entire population of Bitter Creek, including the reformed Pike twins, Now stooped and gentle old men who ran an orphanage gathered at Mercy's fountain to scatter wildflowers and recite the poem she loved best, the one that declared, "The mountain does not bow, and neither shall the spirit that has survived the avalanche." The town was never the same, not a single plank or brick, because the blood and iron of Gideon's justice had been absorbed into the very soil. And from that soil grew a community where the weak were protected and the cruel were exiled before their rot could spread, a living testament to the terrifying mercy of a silent writer's creed. And so the legend passed into the territory's oral history, a story told around campfires and in sod houses when the wind howled, a story of a crippled widow who was laughed at until a man named Gideon rode in to execute a justice so complete that it left the frontier forever changed and forever silent before the mystery of human cruelty and the grace that dares to answer it. If this tale of reckoning stirred something deep within you, please subscribe to Stories Hub Official. Smash that like button to honor the memory of those who fight for the voiceless, and drop a comment below telling us what you would have done if you had witnessed Adelaide's suffering on that dusty street, because your words might be the spark that ignites the next great story of frontier justice.